February 7, 1981, and Vermont was buried under one of the worst winter storms in decades, with weather forecasts warning of whiteout conditions and temperatures dropping to -15 degrees across the northern part of the state. Route 100 wound through the Green Mountains, connecting small towns and ski resorts, a scenic highway that became treacherous during winter storms, when visibility dropped to zero and snow accumulated faster than plows could clear it. 3 college students from Burlington had driven south that Saturday morning before the storm hit, planning a weekend ski trip at Killington Resort, about 70 miles from their campus at the University of Vermont. David Chen was 21 years old, a junior studying engineering, tall and athletic with dark hair and glasses, and he'd borrowed his father's brown 1978 Chevrolet Impala for the trip. His girlfriend Amanda Reeves was 20, a pre-med student with blonde hair cut short and a serious demeanor, and she'd been dating David for 8 months after meeting in a chemistry study group. Their friend Marcus Thompson was 22, a senior studying business, gregarious and outgoing, known for organizing social events and always having stories that made people laugh at parties. The 3 friends had left Burlington at 8 a.m., with weather reports saying the storm wouldn't arrive until afternoon, giving them plenty of time to reach Killington, check into their hotel, and be safely inside before conditions deteriorated. David called his parents from a gas station in Waterbury at 9:15 a.m. to let them know they were making good time and expected to arrive at Killington by 11 a.m. at the latest. But the storm arrived earlier and more intensely than meteorologists had predicted, with heavy snow beginning to fall around 9:30 a.m. and rapidly worsening as they drove south through increasingly rural areas. At 10:45 a.m., Amanda called her roommate from a payphone at a small general store in the town of Rochester, approximately 20 miles north of Killington, and said the weather was getting bad. "We're debating whether to turn back or push through to the resort," Amanda told her roommate. "David thinks we're close enough to make it, but the visibility is terrible and I'm getting nervous about the roads." That phone call was the last confirmed contact anyone had with the 3 students, and what happened to them after they left that general store in Rochester remains one of Vermont's most enduring mysteries. The storm intensified throughout the afternoon, dropping over 2 feet of snow and creating drifts that made many roads impassable, and state police warned everyone to stay off the highways until plows could clear them. David's parents became concerned when their son didn't call by evening as he'd promised, and they tried calling the hotel at Killington only to learn that David, Amanda, and Marcus had never checked in. By Sunday morning, when the storm had passed and roads were being cleared, David's father reported the 3 students missing, and Vermont State Police began the process of trying to locate the brown Chevrolet Impala. Route 100 between Rochester and Killington was searched by police and volunteers once conditions allowed, with officers checking ditches and shoulders and anywhere a vehicle might have slid off the snow-covered road. In the span of approximately 6 hours while driving through a massive winter storm on Vermont mountain roads, 3 college students vanished along with their vehicle and have never been found. If this mystery has you hooked, make sure you're subscribed for more unsolved cases, hit that like button, and comment where you're watching from or what theories you have. Now let's continue the investigation. The general store owner in Rochester confirmed that 3 young people matching the descriptions had stopped around 10:30 a.m., bought coffee and snacks, and asked about road conditions ahead. "I told them the storm was getting worse and they should consider waiting it out or heading back north," the store owner recalled. "But they seemed confident they could make it to Killington before it got too bad." Search teams focused on the 20-mile stretch of Route 100 between Rochester and Killington, a winding mountain road with steep drops on one side and dense forest on the other, and numerous places where a vehicle could leave the road. The massive snowfall had buried everything under 2 feet of fresh powder, making it difficult to see tire tracks or evidence of a vehicle leaving the pavement, and searchers worried the Impala had gone into the woods or down an embankment. Helicopters joined the search once weather permitted, flying low over the route looking for any sign of the brown Chevrolet or disturbances in the snow that might indicate a crash site, but the forest was dense and the terrain difficult. Ground teams with search dogs walked sections of the highway, checking areas where the roadway curved sharply or had steep shoulders, places where a driver might lose control in whiteout conditions and slide off into the woods. Days passed without finding any trace of the vehicle or the 3 students, and the search expanded to include side roads and logging trails that connected to Route 100, though most were impassable without snowmobiles. David's father drove the route himself repeatedly, stopping at every house and business to ask if anyone had seen the brown Impala or the three young people, but nobody reported seeing them after they'd left Rochester. The families held out hope that perhaps the students had made it off Route 100 onto a side road and were stranded somewhere waiting for rescue, but each day without contact made survival seem less likely. By February 10th, over 200 volunteers had joined Vermont State Police in searching the route and surrounding areas, with teams on snowmobiles exploring logging roads and old trails that might have seemed like escape routes during a blizzard. The temperature had remained brutally cold since the storm, with nighttime lows reaching -20 degrees, and survival experts warned that anyone stranded without proper shelter and supplies wouldn't have lasted more than a day or two. Trooper Michael Hayes coordinated the search efforts and reviewed maps showing every possible road the students could have taken, including unmarked Forest Service roads and private driveways that wouldn't appear on standard maps. They were driving south on Route 100, that much we know, Hayes told the families, but somewhere between Rochester and Killington, they either went off the road, took a wrong turn, or something else happened that we haven't figured out yet. The brown Chevrolet Impala became the focus of intense searching because finding the vehicle would presumably lead to finding the three students, whether they were alive, injured, or deceased from exposure. Every gas station, store, and restaurant along Route 100 and connecting roads was contacted with descriptions of the car and the students, but nobody reported seeing them after the Rochester General Store. Search teams checked every pull-off and scenic overlook where someone might have stopped to wait out the storm, and they investigated several abandoned cabins and hunting camps where the students might have sought shelter. But each location searched yielded nothing. No signs of the Impala, no footprints in the snow that had since been covered by subsequent smaller storms, no evidence that anyone had been in these remote structures recently. The families couldn't understand how a full-sized sedan, with 3 people inside, could simply vanish on a highway that was searched thoroughly by hundreds of people, and the impossibility of it added to their anguish. Amanda's mother, Sarah, arrived in Vermont from Connecticut and spent days walking sections of Route 100 herself, calling her daughter's name into the silent, snowy forest, convinced that Amanda was out there somewhere needing help. Marcus Thompson's parents flew in from Ohio and hired a private helicopter service to conduct additional aerial searches, photographing the terrain from above and analyzing images for any unusual disturbances in the snow or tree damage. David's father, Frank, contacted every tow truck company and repair shop within a 100-mile radius, asking if anyone had been called to help a stranded brown Impala, but none had any record of such a call. By late February, the intensive daily search operations had been scaled back, due to the vast area to cover and the diminishing hope of finding anyone alive after 3 weeks in winter conditions. Vermont State Police kept the case active and continued following up on tips, but the reality settled in that the 3 students had likely died from exposure somewhere in the mountains, and spring thaw might be needed to locate them. Theories about what had happened ranged from tragic accident to something more sinister, with some suggesting the students had encountered foul play rather than simply succumbing to the storm. One theory proposed that David had taken a wrong turn onto a logging road thinking it was a shortcut, driven deep into the forest, and become hopelessly stuck where searchers hadn't looked yet. Another suggested the car had gone off the road into a ravine or stream, and the subsequent snow had completely buried it in a location that would only be visible once the snow melted in spring. A more troubling theory suggested the students had been picked up by someone after their car broke down or got stuck, and this person had harmed them for reasons unknown. But this theory struggled to explain what had happened to the Impala itself, because abandoned vehicles were typically found quickly even in remote areas, and no brown Chevrolet had been located anywhere. The case was featured in local Vermont newspapers throughout February and March, keeping the story in public consciousness and generating tips from people who thought they'd seen something relevant. One man reported seeing 3 young people walking along Route 100 during the storm, but he couldn't say exactly where or when, and his account was considered unreliable due to the poor visibility conditions that day. A woman claimed she'd seen a brown car with Vermont plates at a rest stop in New Hampshire on February 8th, but investigation revealed it was a different vehicle with occupants who had no connection to the case. By April, when snow began melting across Vermont, search teams returned to Route 100 hoping that evidence would emerge as the landscape revealed what had been buried, and hikers and hunters were asked to report anything unusual. But the spring thaw brought no revelations, no vehicle discovered in a ravine, No remains found in the forest, nothing that explained where 3 college students and a brown Chevrolet Impala had gone. The families organized their own search parties throughout the summer, walking logging trails and bushwhacking through dense forest areas that official searchers might have missed. But they found nothing except the reality of Vermont's vast wilderness. David's father became obsessed with studying maps and topography, identifying every location where a vehicle could conceivably leave the road and disappear from view, and he investigated each one personally over the following years. Amanda's mother contacted psychics and dowsers who claimed they could sense where the students were, and while she knew it was probably foolish, her desperation made her willing to try anything. Marcus's parents established a scholarship fund at the University of Vermont in their son's name, channeling their grief into something positive while accepting they might never know what happened to him. The years passed with painful slowness for the families, with 1981 becoming 1985 and then 1990, and the 3 college students who'd driven into a winter storm became part of Vermont folklore, a cautionary tale about mountain weather and the unforgiving wilderness. Every spring when snow melted, hikers and hunters were reminded to watch for signs of the missing Chevrolet Impala, and Vermont State Police received periodic reports of possible sightings that always turned out to be other vehicles. David's father, Frank, quit his job in 1983 and moved to Vermont permanently, dedicating himself to searching the mountains and interviewing anyone who might have information about what happened to his son and the 2 friends. He bought topographical maps and marked every logging road, hiking trail, and abandoned property within 50 miles of Route 100, and he spent years systematically exploring each location looking for evidence. Frank became a familiar figure in small Vermont towns, the grieving father who never stopped searching, and locals would call him when they found old car parts in the woods or noticed anything unusual during hunting season. But none of these leads produced evidence of the brown Impala or the 3 students, and Frank's obsession took a toll on his health and his marriage, which ended in divorce in 1987. Amanda's mother, Sarah, developed severe depression and was hospitalized several times during the 1980s, unable to cope with not knowing what had happened to her daughter or where she might be. She died in 1994 at age 56 from complications related to alcoholism that had developed as she tried to numb the pain of losing Amanda without answers or closure. Marcus's parents eventually moved back to Ohio in 1988, unable to bear living near Vermont and being constantly reminded of the son they'd lost, but they maintained contact with the other families and search efforts. The University of Vermont held memorial services for the 3 students in 1982 and again in 1986, acknowledging that while hope for their survival had faded, their memory remained alive among friends and classmates. Detective James Morrison took over the cold case in 1995 when he joined Vermont State Police, and he approached it with fresh perspective, reviewing every piece of evidence and witness statement from the original investigation. Morrison used emerging GPS technology to map the exact route the students should have taken, and he identified several places where the road conditions in a blizzard could have been particularly treacherous. He organized new searches of areas that might have been inadequately covered in 1981, including steep ravines and thick forest sections where a vehicle could potentially be hidden even after years of seasonal changes. But these renewed efforts produced nothing new, and Morrison came to believe that either the Impala had been buried in a location searchers had simply never reached, or something else entirely had happened that night. By 2000, David would have been 41, Amanda 39, and Marcus 42, ages that made their families wonder about the lives they would have lived, the careers and families they might have had. The case was featured on Unsolved Mysteries in 1989 and again in 1995, generating renewed interest and tips. But as with everything else, investigation revealed nothing that brought authorities closer to answers. One particularly compelling tip came from a man who claimed he'd helped push a stuck car on a side road during the storm, and the description matched the Impala, but he couldn't remember exactly where this had occurred. Investigators followed up extensively, but the man's account proved too vague to be useful, and he eventually admitted he might have confused the date or the details after seeing media coverage of the case. True crime writers became fascinated with the disappearance, and several books were published proposing theories ranging from tragic accident to elaborate abduction scenarios involving multiple perpetrators. Some writers suggested the students had been picked up by someone with nefarious intentions after their car broke down, while others believed they'd driven off the road into a body of water that had since been drained or changed course. The most persistent theory remained that the Impala had left Route 100, possibly on a logging road or private driveway, and had become stuck or crashed in a location that was simply too remote or difficult to access for searchers. Vermont's millions of acres of forest, much of it privately owned and rarely visited, offered countless places where a vehicle and 3 bodies could remain hidden indefinitely, gradually being reclaimed by nature. By 2010, Frank Chen was still searching at age 73. Though his health was failing and he could no longer hike the difficult terrain he'd once covered, and he'd accepted he would likely die without knowing what happened to David. He'd accumulated filing cabinets full of maps and notes and photographs, documenting his decades of searching, an archive of obsession and love that represented thousands of hours seeking answers that remained elusive. Marcus's parents both died in the 2000s without resolution, and their obituaries mentioned that they were survived by their missing son Marcus, whose disappearance in 1981 they'd never recovered from. The brown Chevrolet Impala remained on law enforcement databases as a vehicle of interest, and its description was shared with junkyards and salvage yards across New England in case it ever surfaced. But 40 years after 3 college students drove into a winter storm, no confirmed trace of the vehicle or its occupants had been found anywhere, despite one of Vermont's most extensive and persistent search efforts. By 2015, advances in technology offered new possibilities for investigating the 40-year-old case, and Vermont State Police Cold Case Unit began using drone technology and satellite imagery to search areas that had been inaccessible to ground teams. Detective Sarah Martinez was assigned to review the case using modern investigative tools, and she studied satellite imagery from Google Earth, looking for any unusual depressions or disturbances in the forest canopy that might indicate a vehicle. She identified dozens of potential locations where something man-made might be hidden beneath decades of vegetation growth, and she organized searches using ground-penetrating radar and metal detectors to investigate these sites. Teams hiked into remote areas with sophisticated equipment capable of detecting metal buried under soil and vegetation, and they investigated several promising locations that turned out to be old farm equipment or natural rock formations. Martinez also used GIS mapping to analyze weather patterns from February 7, 1981, determining exactly when and where the heaviest snow had fallen, and trying to narrow the timeline of when the students would have been in specific locations. If they left Rochester at 10:45 a.m. and were driving in increasingly bad conditions, they would have been somewhere between mile marker 35 and 42 when the storm was at its worst, Martinez calculated. This analysis focused search efforts on a specific 10-mile stretch of Route 100, where conditions would have been most dangerous. But even with this narrower focus, the area to search remained vast and difficult. Martinez interviewed elderly residents who'd lived in the area in 1981, asking if they remembered anything unusual during or after the storm, and whether anyone had reported finding abandoned vehicles in the years since. One elderly farmer named Harold Mitchell mentioned that he'd heard snowmobilers talking in the mid-1980s about finding old car parts deep in the woods on abandoned logging land, but he didn't know exact locations. This lead sent investigators searching old logging areas that had been closed since the 1970s, places where roads had become overgrown and nearly invisible, perfect hiding spots for a vehicle that had taken a wrong turn. They found several deteriorating vehicles in these remote locations, but forensic analysis proved none of them were the brown Impala, just abandoned cars from different eras that had been dumped illegally. The theory that the students had encountered foul play was revisited with modern investigative techniques, and Martinez looked for connections to other crimes or disappearances in Vermont during the early 1980s. She discovered that several people had vanished from Vermont highways during winter storms in the 1970s and 1980s, and while some were eventually found to have died from exposure, others remained unsolved. But attempts to connect these cases to a single perpetrator found no evidence of a pattern, and most appeared to be tragic accidents rather than criminal acts. Martinez also investigated whether any convicted criminals had been active in the area in 1981, looking for anyone with histories of violence or kidnapping who might have targeted stranded motorists. One man named Robert Crane, who'd been convicted of assault in 1985, had lived near Route 100 in 1981, and he was interviewed in prison about whether he knew anything about the missing students. Crane denied any involvement and passed a polygraph test, and investigation into his movements during the storm showed he'd been working at a lumber mill with multiple witnesses confirming his presence. By 2020, Frank Chen was 83 years old and in declining health, living in an assisted care facility but still maintaining files about his son's disappearance and corresponding with investigators about the case. He'd spent 39 years searching Vermont's mountains, and he told Martinez during their final interview that he'd accepted he would die without knowing where David was or what had happened. "I've walked thousands of miles through those woods," Frank said. "I've looked in places nobody else thought to search and I've found nothing, which tells me either they're somewhere nobody can reach or something happened that we haven't considered." Martinez organized one final large-scale search in the summer of 2021, using volunteers and technology, covering the most likely areas one more time, with the benefit of 4 decades of forest growth patterns and erosion. Teams used drones equipped with LiDAR to map the forest floor beneath tree canopy, looking for any unusual shapes or metal signatures that might indicate a buried vehicle. But the search produced no breakthrough. The case attracted renewed attention on true crime podcasts and YouTube channels during the 2020s, with amateur investigators analyzing every detail and proposing theories about what might have happened to the 3 students. Some believed the Impala had broken through ice on a pond or stream and sunk, while others thought the students had walked away from their stuck vehicle and died from exposure in a location searchers never reached. A few proposed more elaborate scenarios involving voluntary disappearance or witness protection, but these theories ignored the fact that the students had no reason to vanish, and their families had found no evidence suggesting they'd wanted to escape their lives. The most statistically likely explanation remained that the Impala had left Route 100, become stuck or crashed in a remote location, and the 3 students had either died in the vehicle or while trying to walk out for help. But 43 years of searching had failed to locate any evidence supporting this theory, and the massive forest surrounding Route 100 kept whatever secrets it held about that February day in 1981. By 2024, the disappearance of David Chen, Amanda Reeves, and Marcus Thompson has become one of Vermont's most enduring mysteries, discussed in forums dedicated to missing persons and studied by experts trying to understand how 3 people and a vehicle can vanish so completely. The brown Chevrolet Impala has never been found despite being one of the most sought vehicles in New England history, and its absence after 43 years defies logical explanation given the intensity and duration of search efforts. Frank Chen died in 2022 at age 85 without ever learning what happened to his son, and he was buried holding a photo of David from Christmas 1980, the last holiday they'd spent together before the winter storm. His obituary mentioned that he'd dedicated the last 41 years of his life to searching Vermont's mountains, and that he'd interviewed over 3,000 people and walked an estimated 15,000 miles looking for answers that never came. Detective Martinez continues to review the case periodically, though she's officially retired, and she admits the disappearance challenges everything she understands about missing persons investigations and statistical probability. 3 people in a full-sized car cannot simply cease to exist, Martinez says. The laws of physics don't allow it. Matter doesn't vanish, so they're somewhere in those mountains and eventually someone will find them, even if it takes another 40 years. Vermont State Police maintain the case in their cold case database, and hikers and hunters are still asked to report any unusual findings in the woods, any old vehicle parts or evidence that might finally solve the mystery. But the Vermont wilderness is vast and unforgiving, with millions of acres of dense forest, steep ravines, and remote areas that humans rarely if ever visit, and a vehicle could remain hidden indefinitely in countless locations. The stretch of Route 100 between Rochester and Killington continues to be traveled by thousands of drivers annually, and most have no idea they're passing through an area where 3 college students disappeared into a winter storm. Some locals report uncomfortable feelings when driving that section of highway during storms, though most attribute this to knowledge of what happened rather than anything supernatural or paranormal. The case has inspired changes to Vermont's emergency response protocols, with better coordination between agencies during winter storms and improved tracking of vehicles that might be stranded or missing. Cell phone technology that didn't exist in 1981 has made it easier to locate missing persons quickly. But for David, Amanda, and Marcus, these advances came too late to help. True crime communities remain fascinated with the disappearance, analyzing maps and weather data, and proposing theories about what route the students might have taken and where they might have ended up. Some amateur investigators believe the Impala went off Route 100 onto a private logging road that was later blocked or forgotten, and the vehicle sits rusting in a location that appears on no modern maps. Others think the students made it farther than anyone realized, perhaps taking a wrong turn in whiteout conditions and ending up miles from where searchers focused their efforts. The theory that they encountered foul play from someone who picked them up after their car broke down persists among some investigators, but the complete absence of the vehicle remains impossible to explain under this scenario. Marcus Thompson's younger sister, who was only 10 when her brother disappeared, has continued the family's advocacy for missing persons, and she maintains a website dedicated to the 3 students. "My parents died without knowing what happened to Marcus," she says, "and I've accepted I'll probably die without knowing too. But I want people to remember that 3 young people with their whole lives ahead of them vanished and deserve to be found." The University of Vermont holds a memorial event every February 7th honoring David, Amanda, and Marcus, and current students often express disbelief that people could disappear so completely in the modern era. But the case serves as a reminder that even with technology and resources, wilderness areas can swallow evidence completely, and some mysteries resist solution no matter how many people search or how much time passes. Age progression photos created over the decades showed what the 3 students might look like at 30, 40, 50, and now in their 60s, faces that exist only in computer algorithms and represent lives never lived. The families who remain have found some solace in support groups for relatives of missing persons, connecting with others who understand the specific torture of not knowing whether to grieve or hope. And every winter, when storms blanket Vermont in snow, someone inevitably mentions the 3 college students who drove into a blizzard and were never seen again, their fate a mystery that has endured for over 4 decades. The general store in Rochester where Amanda made her last phone call has changed ownership several times, but the current owners know the story, and sometimes tourists stop to take photos of the place where 3 students were last confirmed alive. Route 100 has been repaved and improved since 1981, with better signs and guardrails, but the mountains and forests surrounding it remain as wild and remote as they were when David Chen drove his father's Impala south into a winter storm. And somewhere in those mountains, in a ravine or under decades of forest growth, or in a location no human has reached, the brown Chevrolet Impala with Vermont plates may still exist, holding the answers to one of New England's most baffling mysteries. Detective Martinez believes the vehicle will eventually be found, perhaps by hikers or construction crews, or someone using future technology that can scan beneath ground and vegetation with perfect accuracy. "It has to be somewhere," Martinez insists, "and when it's found, we'll finally know what happened to those 3 students, whether they died quickly from the cold or survived for days hoping for rescue, and their families can finally have closure. But until that day comes, if it ever does, David Chen, Amanda Reeves, and Marcus Thompson remain among the missing. Their disappearance an enduring mystery that challenges our understanding of how completely people can vanish." The last confirmed sighting shows 3 college friends buying coffee at a general store, making the decision to push forward through a worsening storm rather than turn back, a choice that led to consequences no one could have predicted. And every February when winter storms sweep across Vermont, people remember the 3 students who disappeared, and they wonder if this will be the year when melting snow or a chance discovery finally reveals what the mountains have kept hidden for over 40 years. But the Green Mountains keep their secrets, and the mystery of what happened to 3 college friends on Route 100 during a winter storm in 1981 remains unsolved to this day, a case that may never be resolved. The memorial scholarship established in their names has helped dozens of University of Vermont students pursue their dreams, a living legacy for 3 young people whose own dreams were cut short on a snowy Vermont highway. And in evidence rooms and case files in the hearts of people who knew them, David, Amanda, and Marcus exist as both real people who laughed and studied and planned their futures, and as symbols of how quickly everything can change. The brown Chevrolet Impala, wherever it rests, holds the final chapter of their story, and until it's found, the question of what happened during that winter storm will remain one of Vermont's most haunting, unanswered mysteries.